I'm David Caputo, Professor of Political Science at Pace University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the second MOOC lecture, a massive open online course dealing with the presidential nominating process. In the first lecture, I talked about the various dates involved and the fact that the process was fairly long. Today, I want to do a little bit of math with you. Okay? Remember I said last time that the candidate's goal was to win. Candidates' goals were to win the nomination and also be prepared for the fall election. Well, how do they get to win the nomination? For the Democrats, there are 4,764 delegates to the convention and 319 alternates. So in order to be nominated, you need half, which comes out to 2383. You have to have more than half. So 2383 is the minimum number of delegates that the Democratic nominee needs. Okay, remember that number, because in a few minutes I'll come back and explain several other things to you about that number that's so significant, that are so significant. For the Republicans, their numbers are a little different because they have fewer delegates, 2,472 delegates with 2,032 alternates. The alternates go to the convention, can sit with the delegation, but they don't have any voting power unless one of their delegates is sick or can't go at the last minute or something, then they replace them. So for the Republicans, they need 1,237 delegates. So if you want to be the nominee for the Republican Party, your goal is to get to 1,237. All right, now, of these 2,472 Republican delegates and the 4,764 Democratic delegates, how are they selected? The next lecture will talk specifically about the selection process for both the Republicans and the Democrats, and they are different in terms of how they do the selection process, so keep that in mind. But for now, remember that rules on delegate selection are set by the various national committees, the Democratic and the Republican National Committee. They establish the rules. The Republicans have the possibility of changing by small numbers the number of delegates. This number of delegates may have changed by the time time you listen to this lecture, since it's being taped in late January. Now, the Republicans have decided that in their ruling process that, number one, that there can be no delegates selected prior to March 1st, 2016, except for 4 states: Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. Okay, they permit that as an exception. They also say that prior to March 16th, any selection process has to be proportional, meaning that you cannot have a winner-take-all system. But they do not define what proportional means. Okay, so they leave it to the state. They do say, though, that they think the threshold in terms of getting delegates should not exceed 20%. Okay, I'll come back to that also. Democrats have a similar set of rules in terms of timing of the elections, but all of their selection process is proportional. In other words, if in most cases, if you get 15% of the vote in a state, you're then entitled to get delegates from that state. So for instance, if Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton get 45% of the vote each in the state of Iowa or South Carolina, they would then get 45% of the delegates. Okay, I'm sorry, they would each get 50% of the delegates, because Governor O'Malley would only have 10%, he would not meet the threshold. So therefore he'd get no delegates. Okay? All right. Now, for the Democrats, they have a large number of what are called superdelegates, and we'll come back and talk about them later also in terms of their significance. They are not elected. They're spelled out in party rules. Okay, so now some other interesting facts for you to keep in mind. This tells us a lot about what's happening in the next 2 weeks. In terms of Iowa, Okay? The Democrats are picking 52 delegates. The Republicans are picking 30. In terms of New Hampshire, okay, 32 for the Democrats, 23 for the Republicans. In terms of Nevada, it's 43 for the Democrats. South Carolina, the Democrats are picking 59. So the total number of delegates selected in this month of February, 186 for the Democrats, which is about 3%, about 4% of their total. And for the Republicans, they're picking 50 in South Carolina, they're picking 30 in Nevada. That comes out to 133. And that means about 5% of their delegates were picked in this month. Now, for all the time and attention that has been devoted to these first four primaries, caucuses, especially the Iowa caucuses in New Hampshire, okay, you can see that they definitely have a disproportionate amount of influence on the nominating process. We can go back and talk about that perhaps later, but the important thing to remember here is that in terms of actual delegate selection, Iowa and New Hampshire are minuscule in terms of what's going to happen later in the process. Okay. So why are Iowa and New Hampshire so important? Well, first in the nation. First in the nation in terms of the caucuses for Iowa. And second, New Hampshire, first in the nation in terms of primary. Actual selection where people get to vote in a regular voting booth environment for things. Okay? So we have to understand that these two races have a disproportionate amount of influence. However, the interesting question is, does whoever win Iowa then go on? In some cases they do, in most cases they do not. Remember that in 2008 and 2004, the Republican winner did not go on. In 2012, the Republican winner did not go on to win. Why? Iowa is conservative. It's a smaller state, more rural. The base within the Republican Party is more conservative, more evangelical, meaning they have strong religious beliefs and they interpret a lot about candidates based on their feeling towards religious beliefs. Spent a lot of time in Iowa during the caucuses and the build up to the caucuses. Very interesting to be in Iowa, to see this small state really become the center of the political universe on the morning of February 2nd. Okay? Monday the 1st is the primary. On the morning of the 2nd, in essence, all the journalists are on planes out of town, probably never to come back to Iowa till 4 years later when they start their coverage. It's very interesting to watch how this occurs. So what we have here then is two states that are not typical. New Hampshire is not typical of the United States. Again, it's more rural. It's a New England state. It is, both states are competitive in terms of the national election. Iowa tending to vote Democratic at times, New Hampshire being a swing state. So both are important in that respect, and both candidates for the Democrats and for the Republicans will be spending time in both those states. Now remember I said that for the first four contests, you're going to have about 4% of your delegates picked for the Democrats and about 5% for the Republicans. Okay? Now look what happens when you go to March 1st. March 1st, you're going to have 1,034 delegates picked for the Democrats, and you're going to have 624 picked for the Republicans. That means by the time that's done, you're at 26% of the Democratic delegates being picked and 31% for the Republicans. So 1/4 and 1/3 by March the 1st. So clearly March 1st, I would argue, much more important than Iowa and New Hampshire in terms of delegates. Okay? Largely across the South and parts of the West. Now let's go and look at one other date, and that's March 15th. This is the reason why I've said and I will say repeatedly, it's quite possible that one of the candidates will more or less have the process locked up by then. By 3:15 on the 15th of March, these are larger states, states as Florida, Ohio, and so forth. The Democrats are going to be picking 792 delegates, and the Republicans are going to be picking 367. And at the end, the Republicans have picked 60%, and the Democrats 50%. So at that point, we should have a very good idea as to exactly how the rest of this is going to play out, because the Republicans have 40% of the delegates left. And remember, after the 15th of March, the Republicans go to a winner-take-all system. They're permitted to have a winner-take-all system. And we'll talk, what that means is if you win the primary or the caucuses, you get all the delegates. Versus prior to then, everything has to be proportional. So for the Republicans, it's possible by the 15th of March to have a very good idea, just doing the math going forward. For the Democrats, what you're looking at is 50%. Remember, they're proportional going forward. So if Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton are involved in a very close race, and it's like 55-45, 60-40, 40-60 in some of these primaries, they could each end up with about 25% of the delegates, which means going forward, they're in it for the long run. Okay? Now, I think Governor O'Malley is less likely to be in it after the 15th unless he's able to catch fire. Same thing goes for some of the Republican candidates. Rand Paul and others are likely to be out by then because if they have not picked up any strength in the March 1st or March 15th primaries. Okay? So what we have here is a process that's very hard to predict. Most people at this point are speculating that Donald Trump will be able to prevail. Ted Cruz, however, argues that, look, since the early races are proportional, I'll be able to get a large number of delegates, and that will propel me then into the second part of the campaign, and that's the campaign from March 15th on, where I can be seen as a viable candidate. Clearly, Donald Trump's strategy at this point, we'll talk more about this next lecture, clearly Donald Trump's strategy, however, is to win Iowa, win New Hampshire, and in essence say, look, I'm the only candidate. I'm the only candidate that's viable. I'm the only candidate that has won. Ted Cruz needs, and the other candidates need to do well in the early primaries and caucuses in order to blunt the possibility that Mr. Trump would have in arguing about the obvious fact that he's going to be the nominee. So remember these two numbers, 50 and 60% by March 15th. So normally, remember what the Republicans wanted to do is they wanted to front load their process more so they would have their nominee earlier. They may do that by going to the front loading with 60% of the delegates selected by March 15th. So this is another aspect of the nominating process that I think we have to take a step back and think about. Remember who are setting these rules. The rules are being set by the national committees. Now, one alternative that's been advanced that has two parts to it. One part is to go to a national primary and let everyone vote on a set date for the various parties. The parties don't like that. The states don't like that for obvious reasons. The second is to go to regional primaries. And in essence, we are seeing that in default. If you look, when we talk about the March 1st primaries, you'll see that there's a large grouping in the South that will determine the outcome of that particular set of elections. So with that as background, so first lecture we talked about the dates. Second lecture we now talked about the math that's involved. Remember the math. The Democratic nominee needs to get 2,383 delegates. The Republican needs to get 1,237, both 50% plus one in their respective parties. So that is what the fight is for. That is what the different candidates are attempting to do at this point. We'll come back. Next time I want to talk to you specifically about the Iowa caucuses, how the caucuses work, why they're so important for both the Democrats and Republicans, I would point out one thing at this point about Iowa. Remember, I said that Iowa, the Democrats are picking 52 delegates. That's not exactly true. The news media will be reporting as if there's 52 delegates. What they're selecting are delegates to go to county conventions. County conventions are held in another month or so. At those conventions, you then have people who will then go to the district, congressional district conventions, and then those people in June will go to the state convention. At each stage, delegates are picked. So it's possible that you might have delegates picked now who are pledged for X. By the time June comes around, they may be pledged to Z. And I'll have more to say about that in the next lecture. Thank you.